23 hours locked in, surviving the world's most isolated prison cell. The steel door slammed shut with a force that echoed like an explosion through the concrete tier. Inside the control booth, a correctional officer froze, eyes locked on the surveillance monitor. Cell H17. Solitary confinement. The most secure range inside ADX Florence, the United States federal Supermax prison. For 23 hours a day, the men in this unit never saw another human face. But right now, something was wrong. The inmate inside H17 was standing motionless in the center of his concrete cell. Not on his bunk, not pacing like usual. Just standing. Head tilted slightly upward. Lips moving. The officer leaned closer to the screen and turned up the audio pickup. Silence. No voice. No words. Just the faint sound of breathing, and fingernails scraping slowly across concrete. Backup was called immediately. When the response team reached the door, they followed protocol, full tactical gear, shields first. Solitary inmates in ADX weren't placed there by accident. Every man on this range had a history of extreme violence, escape attempts, or ordering crimes from inside prison walls. The food slot camera gave them their first close look. The inmate's eyes were open, wide, unblinking, fixed on the door as if he'd been waiting. Then he smiled. Not a normal smile. A slow, unnatural stretch across his face. And that's when they saw the writing. Every inch of the concrete walls behind him was covered in markings, symbols, tally scratches, fragmented sentences carved with something sharp. Some written in blood. Some etched so deep they cut into the cell's foundation paint. He hadn't done that overnight. This had been happening for weeks, unnoticed. The shift commander gave the order to open the outer port for extraction. But before the locking mechanism even finished cycling, the inmate lunged at the door with full force, screaming incoherently, slamming his body against reinforced steel. Inside the booth, alarms erupted across the control panel. Psychological break risk. Maximum isolation instability. The officers hesitated, just for a second, because every guard on that range knew this truth. When a man breaks inside Supermax solitary, there's nowhere left to move him. No higher security. No deeper lockdown. This was the end of the line. And as the inmate continued smashing himself against the door, laughing and screaming in the same breath, the question no one wanted to say out loud hung in the air. What happens when the system designed to contain the most dangerous minds starts destroying them instead? To understand how he reached this point, how a man could unravel inside a concrete box, we have to rewind to the beginning. Before ADX Florence. Before solitary confinement. Back to the crimes that made the federal government decide he could never again live among other men. Long before Cell H17, he had a name that correctional officers across multiple federal facilities already recognized. He entered the prison system in the late 1990s after being convicted on federal charges tied to organized violent crime, armed offenses, racketeering activity, and involvement in coordinated assaults. The sentence was long enough to ensure he would spend the majority of his adult life behind bars. At first, he was housed in a high-security United States penitentiary, the kind of prison built for inmates considered dangerous, but still manageable within a general population unit. That assessment didn't last. Incident reports began stacking up within his first 2 years. Fights in the yard. Possession of improvised weapons. Refusal to comply with lockdown orders. None of it unusual for high-security prisons, until the escalation began. According to Bureau of Prisons records, he was linked to organizing coordinated violence inside his housing block, using coded messages passed through vents and meal slots. Staff intercepted notes suggesting planned assaults on rival inmates and even threats toward correctional officers. He was placed in administrative segregation, prison isolation used as a disciplinary step. 23 hours alone. 1 hour for a shower or recreation in a caged enclosure. Concrete. Steel. Silence. For many inmates, segregation is temporary, weeks, maybe months. For him, it became a pattern. Every time he returned to general population, violence followed. Investigators later concluded he had begun building influence, using reputation and fear rather than physical presence to control others. That made him more dangerous, not less. Then came the incident that sealed his transfer. During a routine escort movement, he and another inmate attempted an ambush on staff using sharpened metal fragments hidden in legal paperwork. The attack was stopped quickly, but it triggered a federal review. The Bureau of Prisons labeled him a continued threat to institutional safety. Within months, the transfer order was signed. Destination: ADX Florence, Colorado, the most secure prison in the United States. A facility designed specifically for inmates who could not be controlled anywhere else. The transport process itself reflected that designation. Full restraints, black box handcuffs, waist chains, armed escort teams. He was moved through multiple transfer centers before finally arriving in the Colorado mountains, isolated, silent, surrounded by nothing but desert and razor wire. Staff there had a saying: ADX isn't where you're sent for punishment, it's where you're sent when nowhere else can hold you. When intake officers processed him, psychological screenings already flagged aggression, hypervigilance, and early signs of paranoia. Still, he was cleared for placement inside the control unit. Permanent lockdown. 23 hours alone. A concrete cell designed to eliminate human contact. What no one knew yet was how quickly that isolation would begin reshaping his mind, and how the first warning sign would appear not in violence, but in silence. The first weeks inside ADX Florence followed a routine so controlled it barely felt like time was moving at all. Lights on. Meal slot open. Tray pushed through. Slot closed. Silence again. His cell measured roughly 7 by 12 feet. Poured concrete walls, a steel door, a narrow slit window angled upward so he could see only sky. No horizon. No ground. No sense of distance. The Bureau of Prisons designed it that way on purpose. Disorientation was part of the architecture. For 23 hours a day, he remained alone inside that box. Recreation meant being escorted, shackled, to another empty concrete enclosure, sometimes called a dog run, where he could walk in circles under open sky for exactly 1 hour before being returned. No conversation. No physical contact. Even medical and psychological visits happened through thick glass. At first, staff reports described him as compliant, quiet, observant, too observant. Guards noted he rarely slept. Night shift officers reported seeing him standing at his door for hours, watching the shadow movement under the hallway lights. Then came the counting. Every Supermax inmate tracks time differently. Push-ups, pacing, prayer. He used scratches. 1 mark per day etched into the wall beside his bunk using a sharpened fragment believed to have been broken from a plastic meal utensil and hardened against concrete. When officers conducted routine searches, they logged the tally marks but saw nothing unusual. Until the scratches stopped being tallies. Weeks later, words appeared. Single phrases carved deep into the paint. No sound. No time. Still here. Psychological services increased observation frequency, but communication remained minimal. When asked direct questions through the cell door, he either stayed silent or smiled faintly without answering. Sleep deprivation became visible. Dark circles deepened. His pacing patterns grew erratic, sometimes fast and aggressive, other times painfully slow, like he was moving through water. Then guards began hearing him talk. At first, they assumed he was speaking to staff during rounds. But audio pickups confirmed something else. He was speaking when no one was there. Full conversations, pauses included, as if responding to voices only he could hear. Supermax isolation had long been debated for its psychological impact, but officers working that range witnessed it firsthand, men entering stable and slowly deteriorating. Still, protocol allowed no change unless the inmate became an active threat. That threshold came one night during count. A guard passing H17 noticed something covering the observation window from inside the cell. Paper was prohibited in large quantities, meaning whatever blocked the view had been improvised. The extraction team was assembled immediately. When they opened the food slot camera to look inside, they saw the walls covered, floor to ceiling, symbols, words, deep carvings, and in the center of it all, He was standing perfectly still, smiling at the door, waiting. The same moment that would soon trigger the alarm we began with. And for staff to confront a reality Supermax was never built to solve. When the extraction order was finally given, the corridor outside cell H17 went silent. 5 officers in full tactical gear formed the stack, shields forward, restraints ready, a medical officer positioned behind them. Every movement followed Supermax protocol, rehearsed for worst-case scenarios. The steel door locks disengaged one by one with heavy mechanical clanks. Inside the control booth, supervisors watched through multiple camera angles. The door opened 6 inches. Then 12. The inmate didn't charge this time. He didn't move at all. He stood in the exact same position, center of the cell, eyes fixed forward, lips twitching slightly like he was finishing a conversation no one else could hear. Officers entered slowly, issuing verbal commands. Face the wall. Get on your knees. No response. When they stepped closer, they saw details the cameras couldn't fully capture. His fingernails were worn down to jagged edges from carving the walls. His knuckles were swollen from repeated impact against steel. The symbols surrounding him weren't random. Many were fragmented sentences layered over each other, as if time itself had collapsed inside the room. Medical staff made the call on site. Acute psychological decompensation. In simple terms, he had mentally broken. He was restrained without resistance, which officers later described as more disturbing than violence. He allowed himself to be cuffed, eyes still scanning the air as if tracking movement invisible to everyone else. As he was escorted down the solitary range, other inmates, locked behind solid doors, began pounding on their walls. In Supermax, sound travels strangely through concrete. They couldn't see him. But they knew. Mental breaks in isolation units sent a ripple of tension through the entire block. Because every man there understood how thin the line was between control and collapse. He was transferred to the prison's psychiatric services unit, still isolated, but under constant observation. Evaluations later confirmed severe sensory deprivation effects, auditory hallucinations, time distortion, paranoia, and identity dissociation, symptoms documented in long-term solitary confinement studies across the U.S. federal system. He would never return to general population. And he would never return to the same solitary range either. Staff reports concluded that extended isolation, originally intended to contain his violence, had accelerated psychological deterioration instead. A system built to neutralize danger had produced a different kind of crisis. Today, ADX Florence still operates under the same permanent lockdown structure. 23 hours alone, 1 hour out, minimal human contact. Correctional officers continue to monitor inmates like him through reinforced glass and steel, watching for the same warning signs. The pacing. The silence. The scratching on the walls. Because inside America's most isolated prison cells, the greatest threat isn't always what inmates might do to others, but what isolation can do to the human mind when there's nowhere left to escape. End of story.